Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting program. I know you're going to have a very interesting afternoon to meet our author today, Jill Hunting, and we're delighted that she's part of our Authors and Journeys series at the Pasadena Public Library. So we have a lot of guests coming today, and we'll just wait a few minutes to get going. But as we're waiting, I want to remind you, and by this time, everybody kind of knows the drill. So if you could please mute yourself. We will be putting questions in chat. And if you have a question, please put them in chat. And after the program, our author, Jill, will be very happy to answer all of your questions. She's very graciously allowed us to record today's program, and it will be on YouTube, Pasadena Library, for you to view afterwards and to share with your friends and family. I want to tell you that we have copies of this wonderful book in the Pasadena Public Library, For Want of Wings. It's also available at Vroman's Bookstore and other bookstores in Los Angeles and throughout the United States. So if you like to read a copy immediately, you can get it from Pasadena Library, or you can purchase a copy for yourself. We have a lot of people joining. I think I've reminded everybody about the chat. To please mute yourself. We're going to be recording and live transcript. In 1872, a young graduate of Yale University named Thomas Russell unearthed the bones of an 83-million-old dinosaur in western Kansas. So be sure, and we're going to ask Jill how all of the 83 million relates to the Rose Bowl. It's very interesting. The rare fossil, an avian dinosaur with teeth and frightless wings, proved that birds evolved from reptiles, flightless. More than a century later, Russell's great-granddaughter sent out to retrace her ancestors' forgotten expedition. This book is part detective history, part memoir, and For Want of Wings is Jill Hunting's captivating account of her journey into prehistory, national history, and family history. She did an amazing amount of original research. She went to libraries across the United States, and Jill has this wonderful background of doing research. And so we're going to learn all about Jill this afternoon, and we're just delighted to be able to welcome Jill today. Jill?
Thank you, Christine. And hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all and to have you joining us. I'm so pleased to be part of the Pasadena Public Library's Authors and Their Journeys series. And I want to begin by thanking the Pasadena Library for helping me borrow the microfilm of O.C. Marsh's unpublished papers from Sterling Library at Yale. And the library also permitted me to use in the book an archival photo of the sons of the abolitionist John Brown at their cabin in the mountains above Pasadena. So today I'm going to talk about two journeys. First, my journey to becoming an author, and second, the journey that led to this book that I'm here to talk about today, For Want of Wings. The title comes from a description of the 83-million-year-old avian dinosaur that Thomas H. Russell, my great-grandfather, discovered in western Kansas in 1872 when he was 20 years old. The first slide, please, Tiffany. Here is Tom Russell at the age of 20 when he graduated from Yale. We want the slide that says where it all began. There he is, looking like a matinee idol, I think. The fossil he discovered, Hesperornis regalis, had wings, but over millions of years, the wings had atrophied and it was a bird that could not fly. So first to my journey of becoming an author. Before I moved to Pasadena I lived in Sonoma, California, about an hour north of San Francisco, and I was working in Napa as a wine and food magazine editor. Editors of magazines like this receive a lot of invitations to winery events and luncheons. And when the editor-in-chief couldn't attend, she sometimes sent me. So one day I arrived early for an event in the Sonoma Valley, and I was sitting alone looking out over the valley at a hill that was covered with oak trees. And farmers and vintners were complaining about feral pigs in the woods. And I sat there and I thought, oak trees, pigs, truffles. And I wondered if there might be truffles growing in California underneath these oak trees. So as you may know, truffles are related to mushrooms. They have a very strong fragrance, but humans can't smell them when they're underground, and that's why they're hunted with pigs or dogs. So I became very curious about the possibility of truffles growing in Northern California. And as a way to learn more about them, I began writing a little newsletter about them. And I thought, well, maybe I will turn this into a book someday. And around the same time, my editor-in-chief told me she was organizing a food writers retreat in Italy, and she invited me to go along. Well, my grandmother had passed away and left me a little money, and I thought she would be pleased if I used it to go to Italy. So off I went to Umbria. And on the first day there, a group of about 8 or 10 of us were sitting around a table. We were talking about our writing and our ambitions. And I said that I was thinking about writing a book about truffles, but it had not come into focus. And an idea popped into my head. And I said, I think my interest in this mysterious underground food might be related to something that happened in my family. I said, I had an older brother. He was killed in Vietnam under mysterious circumstances. My family didn't talk about it. We buried it. And one of the other writers interrupted me and said, I would read that book about your brother. So that day, I turned my attention from truffles to exploring the story of my brother. And he had written a lot of letters, I knew, but I had only 4 letters that he'd written home to actually to one of my sisters. Eventually, by the time I finished the book, I had found 175 letters he had written. And I will be talking about that book, Finding Pete, next month on May 17 as part of the library's Asian American and Pacific Islanders series. So I had written newspaper and magazine articles before, but never a book. I didn't know how to write a book. So I applied to the Breadloaf Writers Conference and was accepted and went to Breadloaf with my first chapter, which I workshopped. And I learned from other writers and lecturers about plot, character, and voice. And these are elements of fiction that are borrowed for the genre of narrative nonfiction. And that's the kind of book I intended to write. So after Breadloaf, I went to Vietnam. I came home and I plugged away at the manuscript. I got a book contract. And then when Finding Pete was published in 2009, I had a modest book tour. I was in Connecticut. It happened to be the week of my birthday. And as a gift to myself, I'd planned to take the day off and spend it at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven. I knew that this was the museum where my great-grandfather's fossil was on exhibit. I had corresponded a bit with a paleontologist there at the Peabody, and he had said, if you ever come to New Haven and you would like to see your great-grandfather's fossils, let me know. So I let him know, and I arrived at the Peabody. We went down into the basement, and on several tables, he had laid out all the specimens that Tom Russell had found. And there were dozens of them, and they were knobby and tan. And my first thought was, wow, these look like white truffles, but they didn't smell. But when I picked them up and held these things in my hands, Tom Russell became real to me. But I didn't have a book yet. So now I'm going to change gears and say something more about this dinosaur. Its name, Hesperornis regalis, means regal western bird. The chances of any creature becoming a fossil are extremely rare. So little of an animal usually survives, and of that only bones and teeth, that trying to understand the living creature it once was is like solving an elaborate mystery. How did its lifeless skeleton survive? How could Russell's bird have sunk intact to the bottom of the shallow ocean that once covered a vast portion of North America? How did it escape becoming food for a scavenger? After the western interior seaway receded, how did the bird's delicate skeleton evade being crushed by tons of sediment as geological forces shaped and reshaped the Earth's crust? How is this small creature then lifted to the Earth's surface in its tomb of chalk to await discovery millions of years later by a novice fossil hunter from New Haven? What led Tom Russell, who would spend his entire life in the city of his birth, to sign on for an uncertain journey into the American West? What did he think and feel when he noticed in an outcropping the locals called Goblin Hollow, one or two protrusions in the exposure, looking less like rough sedimentary rock than smooth bone? It is hard to imagine he ever thought that a great granddaughter would one day follow him there and, like a paleontologist arranging fossil parts, piece together fragments of his trip west in hopes of understanding what he saw and felt. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Going to Kansas set me on a course to learn more about the little-known 1872 expedition, fossil hunting, US history, as my forebears intersected it at critical points, and the generations of my Yale-centric ancestors. I became a paleontologist of my family, looking at strata and piecing together fragments to form a more complete picture. My quest showed me that evolution, far from being limited to prehistoric life, also takes place in families that adapt to the necessity of their environment and their time on Earth. Along the way, I came to understand history differently than what I had learned in college, studying American history and literature. History is not a straight line. Only in retrospect does it seem so when we see patterns emerging and what looks like a flow of events. History is dynamic, fluid, and alive. It is, as the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico describes systems ranging from the economy to weather, nonlinear, complex, and adaptive. What is history if not a process that is random, accidental, and uncontrollable, a succession of chance encounters and unforeseen meetings, interruptions, tangents, events in the present that circle back to an earlier time, lost letters that reappear, things cast off, recycled, reused? How did you happen to become friends with that person? Put down roots where you did. Meet the person you married. Pick up this book. Whatever the reasons, they likely involved happenstance. In 2010, I went to Kansas to see the fossil bed and invited May, my only child, to go with me. Next slide, please. I had looked at the location on Google Earth. There was no housing development, no gas station, no grocery store, no post office. I was very excited to think that it looked just the way it had in 1872 when my ancestors saw it. May and I were both at crossroads. She had just ended a long-term relationship with her college boyfriend, with whom she and several other friends had founded a climate organization that became known as 350.org. May was worried that the breakup would damage the organization to which she was devoted. My situation was different. I had published my first book. I lived alone. I was free to go back to food and wine work or try something else. I was not unhappy, but I was looking for direction. This is the situation when For Want of Wings opens. And I'll read just the opening paragraphs of part 1. Do something you've always wanted to do, something you've never done before, like jumping out of an airplane. That was the advice my doctor, a friend, gave me as I sat in his examining room after a routine physical. He had just told me I was going to live forever. So I asked him what he would do if he were me to celebrate a milestone birthday. I didn't want to parachute out of an airplane, but I did want to see Russell Springs, Kansas, where my great grandfather, Thomas H. Russell, as a member of the 1872 Yale College scientific expedition, discovered a nearly complete fossilized skeleton of a dinosaur that lived 83 million years ago. I thought it would be fun to take my 26-year-old daughter, May, my only child, with me. I called her and asked, how would you like to go to Kansas? I lived in Sonoma, California at the time, and she was in San Francisco, about an hour away. The idea was a whim, and yet more complicated than that. It was the kind of idea that as soon as you think of it or say it aloud, you recognize is coming from deep within. The significance of the trip would grow on me gradually and then profoundly. Now I'd like to talk about the journey of writing this book. First, I didn't want to write a history book per se. There is a lot of history in this book, but I wanted to be an active participant in the story and invite the reader to come with me on a journey. This genre goes by various names, including narrative nonfiction, researched memoir, participatory journalism, immersive journalism, creative nonfiction. Some of the most famous authors who write in this genre are George Plimpton, Ted Conover, and Susan Orlean. I approach the book's structure like a road trip. If you can imagine driving west to east on Interstate 40 with Santa Fe as your destination, you're in Arizona and you see a sign for Meteor Crater. It's a detour of 6 miles, a deviation. You look at your friend and you say, shall we do it? I've always wanted to see that. So off you go, you see Meteor Crater, this fascinating place. Then you're back on the road, back on the interstate, still headed for your destination, but you've had a detour. So some of the detours I took in this book are chapters about the descendants of John Brown, who settled in Pasadena, 3 of them. John Brown was a good friend of my great-great-grandfather, the fossil hunter's father. He was a frequent guest in the Russell home in New Haven, and I'm sure that Tom Russell would have met him as a boy. Another chapter is about the wild green parrots who fly over my house every morning and evening. Next slide. These are the Jones Triplets at their lemonade stand down the street from my house. I have a chapter about them because I invited them to come talk with me about dinosaurs, and they know a lot about them. And I also wanted to include these girls as a way of saying that it isn't just boys who love dinosaurs, girls love dinosaurs, and for that matter, it isn't just paleontologists, it's all the rest of us. And we seem to really never outgrow our fascination with them. The next slide, please. This is a photograph of the 1872 Yale College expedition. And seated on the far left, holding a rifle and wearing a lot of bullets, is my great-grandfather, Tom Russell. Where this photo was taken and by whom was a mystery. The Peabody Museum had the only known copy when I began this search, and it was a mystery I was able to solve with the help of a lot of people. So, how do you write about an expedition that took place 150 years ago when none of these men are still living, 2 and maybe only 3 of them married and had children? None of them left a written account. Professor Marsh, who's standing in the center, was the leader of the expedition. He later became very famous for discovering Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and Brontosaurus, but he had not discovered them by 1872. However, he was already a famous scientist, and as he traveled across the United States with his party, newspapers reported that the party had come through Denver, Salt Lake City, Chicago, but that was about all they said. And so I did have the photograph. So I asked myself, who could tell me something about this photograph that might help me understand the men and the expedition a bit better? So I showed it to a photography curator at the Huntington Library. She showed me that the light was coming in from the left side of the photo. It was a studio photo, and therefore it was not taken by one of the hundreds of traveling photographers who were working in the American West in the late 1800s. I showed it to a curator at the Denver Art Museum who had written about Cheyenne moccasins for his doctoral dissertation. You can't see the moccasins one of the students is wearing. He's seated at the far right, actually holding a rifle toward his chin. He was wearing moccasins. And so this curator in Denver got me on the track of what those moccasins might be and that they were authentic. Eventually, I found my way to the Mi'kmaq First Nations people in Eastern Canada and Maine. And they identified the pattern on the moccasins as Mi'kmaq. And in fact, this man who's wearing them came from Maine and a family in the lumber business. And the Mi'kmaq people had been trading with citizens of Canada and Maine since the arrival of European settlers on this continent. I showed the photo to clothing experts at Western Costume Company, which is a 100-year-old company that specializes in outfitting actors for the movies. I showed it to a celebrity portrait photographer in Los Angeles, thinking that someone who is behind the camera and makes a living looking at faces might see something in these men's faces. And indeed she did, and gave me some insights that were very helpful in thinking about my ancestor. Last, in terms of my approach to this book, it is a memoir, but it is not what I'll call a recovery memoir. I am not a recovering drug addict like Cheryl Strayed, who wrote Wild. I did not escape from a violent survivalist family like Tara Westover, who wrote Educated, both mega best-selling books. For Want of Wings is what I'll call a journey memoir. It is not about trauma. Today is April 28th, 2022. We have been through a difficult 2 years with the COVID pandemic. And I know that some of you who are with us today have lost loved ones to COVID. In the United States, we are still averaging 360 deaths a day from COVID. Every day, we are bombarded with grim news. And I want to tell you that this is a story about evolution and transformation, discovery, and hope. So one last thing before we get to your questions. If you belong to a book club, I have a list on my website, jillhunting.com, of discussion questions. One of the things that I was very interested in writing this book was the issue of celebrity and fame, and along with that, social media. And I think your book group might find it interesting to discuss fame and celebrity and the importance of these things to you personally. And from my website, you can also write to me using the link on the website, and I would love to hear from you. So, Christine, do we have any questions?
Well, we don't have any questions yet, but before we have, I'm sure we're going to have questions, but before we go to the questions, I want to just thank you for such an excellent, interesting, fascinating presentation about how you wrote it, your author's journey, your family's journey, the research that you did about the photograph, and how you were able to approach whom you were going to ask about that. Naturally, you would think of going to a research institute like the Huntington, or you would go to Yale. But when you actually thought about going to a photographer, that was to see what they could see in the person and see the clothes. we couldn't see the moccasin. So that was very interesting to be able to trace the moccasin, and that there's a particular patterns in the moccasin that leads to what the Indian was. And of course, your great grandfather on Yale, it was in Maine, so it stood to reason that that gentleman probably was in Maine and Canada. So you weren't going to have a Western Indian tribe. Maybe you could have, because if they are in 1872 exploring, they want to explore all over. So did you ever find names for any of these people?
Yes, I found all their names. There was one.
That's absolutely amazing. You're a fabulous researcher to
Oh,
do
thank
that.
you.
And so I think we want to know how did you actually find the names?
Well,
Genealogy or friends or of your great great grandfather?
well, Professor Marsh had actually written down the names of the 4 students he took with him.
Uh-huh.
And this photo has turned up a lot of places, but it is almost always incorrect in identifying the students. They're named backwards, or
Oh,
my great grandfather's discovery is mentioned, but he's identified as someone else in the photo. I was in Sonoma last month talking about the book, and there happened to be a film festival at the same day I was there. And a man and woman came to my book talk. They live on Martha's Vineyard, but they had seen my book in the window and knew I was speaking. This man came up to me and said, "I've known about that photograph for 30 years." And he's not a paleontologist. He didn't go to Yale. But he said his daughter was very interested in dinosaurs. And in fact, their whole family went on a dig every summer, and they had bones in their home that they were allowed to bring home from the dig. So it is what you might call an iconic photograph. And because it's so intriguing, one person bought another copy of this photograph at an estate sale, and he just thought it was a bunch of, as he said, Western guys with guns. They're all heavily armed. And it was a dangerous time in the West in 1872. But so some of the work had been done for me. I had the names, but then it was up to me to find out who Benjamin Hoppin and Charles Hill and all these other people were. And thank goodness for the internet, because I could research all of them. And the Yale alumni clubs had done a lot of, they published obituaries of Yale graduates. So I found information there too.
Well, absolutely fascinating, your research. Really, you're a spectacular detective. Just the odds that someone in Sonoma that came to your book talk had a copy of it. Of course, they came because they knew what the subject of your book was.
Right.
But it's just,
when your last name is Hunting, you don't buy it naturally.
Right. So one of your questions in your discussion questions is the genre of narrative nonfiction borrows certain elements, such as creating characters from fiction. Which characters in For Want of Wings do you find interesting? And obviously, it was your great great grandfather, but did you find that one of his cohorts on this expedition or the dig was equally as fascinating through your research?
Yes, I was particularly interested in Benjamin Hoppin, and he became separated from the expedition party one night. I write about all this in the book, but he drifted away, and he had only one bullet and no coat with him, and he couldn't find his way back to the party. And so he found a buffalo carcass. He lifted the skin up and shook it and pulled it away from the bones, and then spent the night under that buffalo hide. And it must have smelled awful, but the next day he made his way back to the party, and he was very traumatized by this. The account of that story written by Professor Marsh, a short version of that story, does not say that he suffered a nervous breakdown, but he suffered a complete nervous breakdown a few years after this expedition. And he tried various other things, tried to go back to school, tried traveling. He eventually retired, as they said, at the age of 29. And I think that he probably was very sensitive anyway, and the trip was so challenging to him that being lost on the plains with the danger of wolves and rattlesnakes and cold and Indians who were still not on reservations, primarily Cheyenne in that part of the country. The dangers were so great that I think it probably undid him.
Wow. So he had quite a journey. How did the journey towards Tom change your life?
Well, this sounds odd, I think, but I came to love this ancestor who's a great grandfather. I was so interested in him because that photo fascinated me, and all I had ever heard about him in the family was that he was a surgeon and very reserved. And one of my relatives even said he didn't think that Russells were very introspective. And I just thought there must be more to this man than that. So when I saw him in the photograph and learned about the expedition, I just knew there had to be more to him. And I loved what one of his college classmates said about him at the time of his death. He described him as a man to tie to. And that's the kind of person I would like to be. I would like to be a person to tie to, someone reliable that your friends and loved ones know they can trust. So I really came to love that about my great grandfather.
Fascinating, wonderful. Well, as you're researching this, did you think at one time it was probably too big of a project for you? Or I don't think any project's probably too big for you.
Oh,
To tell you the truth, I think you know how to break it down into pieces.
I don't
And
know. I just had a little slice of a story. Um, I did at one point think this might be more than I can do because, as you know, I'm not a paleontologist, and I did not want to become a paleontologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm just someone who asks a lot of questions, and I like to go places and meet people and write about them. So I did have to learn quite a lot about paleontology, and made friends with paleontologists, and I just called up people I didn't know or wrote to them, and or just showed up in the case of Western Costume Company and just began asking questions. And most people did want to talk to me, and they were willing to help. So even though I thought maybe I'd bit off more than I could chew, it all it all worked out somehow.
well, it was just fascinating. It's kind of like putting a jigsaw puzzle, all these little pieces together, and then finally you have a big, um, big project completed. And so someone wants to know your polar bear trophy on page 153. So I'm going to, um, here's the polar bear trophy for those of you that don't have a book. Um, as an animal rights activist, it chilled this person.
Yes. I wasn't sure I should include that photo. It is very sad. Um, that's Benjamin Hoppin, the fellow I mentioned who was lost on the plains. He went on an expedition later in life to the Arctic Circle, and he did write an interesting travelogue about that, unpublished. But the polar bear was a trophy that was killed on that expedition. And I don't know if Benjamin killed it or just had his photograph taken with it. I agree completely with this animal rights person. As I said, I wasn't sure I should include it, but it was a different time. And the attitude toward animals, as we all know, was very different. Polar bears and buffaloes who were hunted almost to extinction. And the the cruelty and the callousness toward animals is something that really came up over and over again. But it was part of life. It was part of what these men were doing at the time, and that's why I included it. So I apologize if you found that offensive.
Well, I think everyone needs to get a copy of this book because your photos in this book are absolutely fascinating. You just showed us a few of them in your wonderful PowerPoint presentation. And also, I want to point out to everyone, when you read this book, there are wonderful acknowledgments, there are notes, and there's a bibliography for you when you become more than fascinated and want to start the journey that Jill took. So everyone is saying that they're very, very impressed by your research, and that it seems to be from a higher guidance. Do you see that this is an impetus to keep you writing? Are you working on another project? Do you have another famous family member? Maybe a lady or?
There are some other characters in the family that are probably worthy of a book, but I'm not moved to write about them yet. Before I wrote Finding Pete and For Want of Wings, I was traveling, and I was in a place where I was really free for my mind to just roam around and come up with an idea. So I think I might need some time off before I think about that. But I will say this, last week, I had dinner with a friend who told me a fascinating story. I don't know that I will write it. I don't think it's my story to write, but I do want to help her bring it to the world. Her mother was a Holocaust survivor from a very wealthy family in Amsterdam. They had the largest house in Amsterdam, so large that the German High Command took it over as their headquarters when they occupied the Netherlands during World War II. And my friend's mother and uncle survived, and the Germans were going through this house and ramming bayonets into the wall, looking for survivors. And time passed. Well, my friend has just had a painting that was hidden in the home between walls, recovered and sent to her. It had a huge bayonet gash in it, and she has been told it might be a Vermeer. So this is the only thing that survived from her family. I think it's such a compelling story. I don't know that it's mine to tell, but I think it's mine to help her tell. So
Absolutely. I think it is yours to
yeah.
help her to tell. Today in Pasadena Now and Star News was an article about a 99-year-old gentleman who survived the Holocaust. Only himself and his cousin were able to do it. And he was 14 or 16 at that time. And because of his perseverance and his creativity, and he thought a higher person was watching over him, helped him survive it. And of course, this is Holocaust Remembrance Day and the period of that. So I think that was just fascinating, the odds that they were able to hide that painting and have a story there. Yes, you're definitely the one with all the research around it. So someone wants to know, did you discover interesting foods the dinosaur hunters ate? How did they survive out there? I mean, they camped or they cooked their food or buffaloes or?
They did eat buffalo. I do write about this in the book. When this Yale party arrived in Kansas, there was a commissary at Fort Wallace, and they bought certain foods there. And but mostly they survived on game, and I think bread that they cooked over a fire. Of course, no fresh fruit and all that. My great grandfather had just graduated in pre-med from Yale. He was one of the first two pre-med graduates. He and his friend were the only pre-med graduates that year. And I wonder what he must have thought of the terrible diet that these poor soldiers in the West were on. You know, I didn't want to neglect something that the last questioner asked, and that was whether I might have been guided by, I'm not sure what the phrase was, a higher power, or if there was a spiritual component to this. And I'll just say about that, that I do feel that the ancestors watch over us. I don't know how. I'd love to know more about that, but I do, I do feel their love for me, and that's all I can say about that.
Okay. So someone wants to know, thank you. Could you talk a little about your experience getting your first book published?
Sure. Well, it really came about because I went to the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and I applied to Breadloaf. You have to submit a writing sample and they judge it. And I received a letter saying that I had been waitlisted. So I wasn't outright even accepted. But when I got that letter, I just knew I was going. So eventually I was accepted and I went. So I had a Cinderella story that led to my getting a book contract. So there is a room at Breadloaf where the writers who are not famous can read from their work. And meanwhile, the famous authors like Susan Orlean and, you know, big names, they're reading in front of 100 or 200 people, and then other people are reading in these smaller rooms. So someone in my workshop said, "Oh, there's a travel night tonight. You've got to sign up for that and read your chapter about Vietnam." So he actually led me to the sign up sheet, and I did that, and I read a little bit. And when that reading was over, this darling young woman came up to me and said, "Is anyone representing you?" And she was an agent from New York. And I said, "No." So Julie Barrow is her name, and she's not my agent now. She's married to a very famous writer now. She has her pick of people. But I worked with Julie, and she helped me find my publisher, which was Wesleyan University Press, for that book.
And so then how did you go about publishing For Want of Wings?
Well,
out in search for a new agent.
Well, I hope no literary agents are watching this, but you know, when you work with a literary agent, you are selling your book to that agent, who in turn is selling your book to a publisher. So you have a middleman. And as an editor myself, I thought I might like to just work with an editor. So a friend of mine had published a book with the University of Oklahoma Press, and she liked working with them. And I grew up in Oklahoma, and I knew of this, of OU Press's reputation. They're a 100-year-old publisher, and they specialize in books about the American West and military history and so forth. So I just wrote to the editor there, the acquisitions editor, and told him about my book. He wasn't quite sure he wanted the book at first. I hadn't finished it. And he said, "Well, I'm not sure you can bring this together, but I'll take a look at it." So when I finished it and sent him the manuscript, then he took it. So I kind of have a Cinderella story all the way through, I think. He came to love the book, and I have a very good relationship with him. But that's essentially the story. I do not have an agent for this book. I went right to the editor, and just had the good fortune that they accepted it.
Well, we can see why. It's such a fascinating book. It's really absolutely enthralling. It captures you right from the very first page with your dedicated research and your inventiveness as well. So you talked a little bit about the fact that you do lots of original research, and you use the interlibrary loan at the Pasadena Public Library. So I'm not sure that everyone on this Zoom program today knows about how you did that. You found a book that you wanted, and we didn't have it at the Pasadena Public Library. And then you sent in a request, and through the interlibrary loan service, we send it out and research. And if it's not in the California library, it can come as far away as Yale, or sometimes even have come from foreign countries.
That's right. And I had read that Othniel Marsh, the famous paleontologist from Yale, had written, let's see, what did he call it? I think a book of adventure. He intended to write a book of adventure, and he had two brief stories about the 1872 expedition. And it was an unpublished manuscript in Sterling Library. And many of their rare materials do not circulate, but I inquired and I found out that they had microfilm of this unpublished manuscript, and they had a duplicate copy that they would lend. So I filled out the interlibrary loan request here in Pasadena, and it took some time, but eventually the reel arrived, and then I was down there in the basement of the main library here in Pasadena, going through microfiche. It was really hard to read. It was dark, and a lot of it was handwritten, but really invaluable to my research. And so that's how that came about.
So did you just borrow one thing through interlibrary loan, or were you able to find other books?
Just that.
Other manuscripts?
Just that.
Just that one.
But I should say that the Huntington Library, of which I'm a reader, which means you can go in and read in the rooms and use their resources. I was researching Lieutenant James Pope, later General James Pope, and I discovered, sort of by coincidence, that a diary he kept as a young man was in the collections of the Huntington Library. So I was able to go into the special reading room there and wear white gloves, and they bring the journal to you. And I have material from that in the book too. He's a fascinating character. He wound up at Fort Leavenworth, was a general, and very interesting guy, but he was just a young second lieutenant, newly graduated from West Point, and did not graduate high in his class, but he was related to a famous General John, whatever his name is, Pope, excuse me, General John Pope. And that's probably how he got this plum assignment to travel with a bunch of Yale students and a Yale professor. So the Huntington Library had that. And then I think that those may have been the only rare materials that I had in person.
And so what other libraries? You visited libraries in Philadelphia, you said?
I was in contact with libraries in Europe and the United States because
Why Europe?
Because when this Hesperornis regalis was found, it was groundbreaking news in the scientific community, and people wanted to study it. They wanted to know about it. But of course, a fossil that rare cannot be sent to another institution for study. It's too fragile, and the possibility of it being lost or never making its way back to Yale was too great. So Marsh came up with a way to have plaster casts made of certain parts of this fossil, and he circulated them to prominent universities in the United States and then in Europe. And these plaster casts are considered a form of publishing because actually even a photograph doesn't help you study a fossil unless it's, the way we can photograph something in 360 degrees now, of course, had not been invented. So these plaster casts of the bones were sent out Montreal, Philadelphia, Berkeley, I think it was about 30 institutions. So I had the list of institutions from the papers of O.C. Marsh, and I just wrote to all of them and said, do you still have any of those plaster casts? Or do you have any of the paperwork? And do you still use them? And so that put me in touch with all these librarians and archivists around Europe and the United States. And even during the pandemic, they were extremely helpful. Many of them couldn't go into their libraries. They could only access things that were digitized that they could look at online. But there were some librarians who said, well, I can look it up, but I only have access to the library once a week. And I have a list of requests from like PhD candidates, professors, and so forth. But even under these trying circumstances of a pandemic, they wrote back to me and said, I found something, here's what I have. And their dedication, I'm such such a great fan and admirer, I'm sure all of you are too, of librarians and archivists, and just how willing these people are to help us with information. I think most libraries have a help desk, and you can call and ask just about any kind of question about your community, and they want to help. And in my first book, Finding Pete, I talk about a library that was built in Vietnam in memory of my brother. And the reason that was important is that he believed, and I believe, that libraries are one of the foundations of a democracy. People have to be able to vote, have elections, have schools, and have libraries. These are keystones of a democracy. And so my admiration and gratitude toward librarians, I can't even put it into words.
Oh, well, thank you very, very much for saying that. And at Pasadena Public Library, each of our branches, and of course we had it at Central Library, a reference desk, and we're very glad to answer questions when you come in person, or you can do them with our Ask Us service. And we do research for people, and we're very happy to do so. Also, I don't know if everybody online knows, when you went to Central Library, you went downstairs and used the machines to read your microfiche. Did you ever? So you did talk a little bit about John Brown. Did you ever use the Pasadena Centennial Room? We had a fabulous Pasadena history collection.
No, but I want to.
So we can talk about that afterwards, how you can access it, and you are able to access it online. Currently, right now, unfortunately, Central Library is closed because of the requirement to retrofit, but we do have access to information online that you can do if people want to research, and we're still answering lots and lots of questions that anyone has. So there's another very interesting question that's come in. You researched your ancestors in Middletown who owned enslaved people.
Yes.
Were you hesitant to include this part of your family's past in the book? Or it was pretty typical of that time?
It was. I wasn't at all hesitant. I wanted to tell that story because first of all, my mother's ancestors came to Connecticut in 1639. And my father's people came early also. There was slavery in New England, which I did not grow up knowing. I thought it was a Southern institution, but there were slaveholders. And as we know, many of the founding fathers were slaveholders. And we know that Yale and Harvard and Brown, Georgetown are all in the news now because of the history of owning enslaved people. So I had read that two of my ancestors were slaveholders. My feeling is that if you know your ancestors owned enslaved persons, you have to go first and admit it, or not just admit it, but talk about it. If we don't talk about this, we're never going to get past this issue. And so I investigated the two ancestors who owned enslaved persons. I have a cousin who is a genealogist. She helped me with this. And Deborah Shapiro, who is the municipal historian in Middletown, Connecticut, helped me with this research as well. And I just feel it's very important to talk about your ancestors if they were slaveholders or enslaved persons. So that's why I included it. And then I'm very relieved to say that my great-great-grandfather, the fossil hunter's father, who was friends with John Brown, was a radical abolitionist. And he was a member of the National Kansas Committee, which was an anti-slavery committee. He was a founding member of the Republican Party, which, as you know, was the party of Lincoln and the anti-slavery movement. And we have family stories that have been passed down about two properties in the family that were homes on the Underground Railroad. And stories passed down about my great-great-grandfather's school in New Haven, in which the boys were told, if you hear noises at night and pots banging in the kitchen, don't say anything about it. Well, these were escaped enslaved persons making their way north, who were being smuggled through his home. So all I can say is, you know, thank goodness we produced an abolitionist. And yeah, I think it's important to talk about it.
Very, very, very important. And possibly you have another book there about your family person that actually, you know, was part of the Underground Railroad and made it possible for slaves.
You know, I'd love to write about him. William Huntington Russell is his name. Someone stepped forward and said they would like to write a biography of him. I think this is at the end of his life. And so the family rounded up his papers and whatever they could find of his writings and sent them off to this biographer who may have been a Yale graduate that he knew. And evidently a manuscript was produced, and then it was shipped to a publisher, not named. And I mean, we don't know who the publisher was, and was lost. So all of his writings were lost. And but I have hope, you know, things turn up sometimes, like a Mozart composition in someone's attic. And so maybe it will turn up, but yeah, he was another interesting character.
Well, you would be the one to do the research for sure, to find out what attic it might be in, or where it is, or you might just be in some antique store at some time and happen to come across it.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yes. Well, you are just a wonderful person to have in Authors and Their Journeys. You really talk about your journey that you've done to write, your research for your book, for Want of Wings, and your research also for Finding Pete. And I want to remind everyone that Finding Pete, you will present that in May. And this, I want to show them the book. This is Finding Pete as well. And of course, it's available at Pasadena Public Library, and you can get it at Vroman's as well as at other bookstores throughout Los Angeles and the United States. So we can't thank you enough, Jill, for taking your time today to share your memoir, your research, your wonderful journey. And we wish you just the very best in your next search. And we'll look forward to hearing about Finding Pete. And we're anxious for your next book.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. Please remember, if you would like to share this fascinating presentation with your friends and family, it will be on YouTube, Pasadena Library. It was recorded to the cloud, and so it takes us about a week to get it down and get it on YouTube. So don't think it's not coming. It will be there. And remember, if you have any questions, you can send them to the Pasadena Public Library online through our Ask Us. Just go to our website, or please come into our branches while Central Library is closed. Our branches are open for service for you. Jill lives in Pasadena and is a wonderful user of Pasadena Public Library. Starting in May next week, we will be celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And we have lots of wonderful programs coming up in addition to Jill's. So thank you so much for attending, and I'll look forward to welcoming you at another program. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you.
Hi, Jill.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, Jill.
Bye-bye. Thank you.